Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a great honor it is today to welcome Tim Shriver as our guest on Conversing. Tim is a person who's well known because his family is well known. The Kennedy clan, in all of its dozens and hundreds and thousands of members, has left an imprint on American life and international life in many, many significant ways. He is one of the children of Sargent and Eunice Shriver. He is himself married, a father of 5, and one of the people who has carried on his mother's legacy as the founder of the Special Olympics, as one who has led the Special Olympics movement for 3 decades. He currently gives himself primarily to the work of the Dignity Index and the work of dignity, of trying to help people understand the nature of human dignity in a variety of different ways. He's a speaker, a former educator, a person who's given himself to the human enterprise, especially among and with and for people who have different abilities, different capacities, different locations in society and culture. His life and his work has been inspirational to millions of people, and it's a great joy to welcome him today to Conversing. Tim, welcome. It's such an honor to have you today.
It's a huge honor for me to be asked. Thank you.
You know, I think it would not be too much at all for me to say that the mark of your family on my own personal life has extended from the time I was in grade school until today. And I mean that in the most positive of ways. And this is a legacy that many, many, many Americans feel toward your family. And I want to say in particular in you and in your generation, having expressed it in a particularly vivid and tactile and visionary way. A lot of that for you, I think, comes out of your 2 parents. So let's just start a bit there about your formation. You've written about this, talked about this, but I think it's one of those subjects that you can't overdwell on, in the sense that there's such riches there that I would just love for you to be reflecting on it now, especially at this stage in your life, perhaps differently than you might have 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a pretty open and broad question. And I have a huge family with thousands of different personalities and moments. So I'll try to distill it as in the spirit of this conversation. And I appreciate the question. I mean, you know, I was born in 1959. My parents moved in 1960 to Washington, D.C. after the election of President Kennedy. And from that point onward, my mom and dad were very much involved in both supporting his leadership, but also in establishing and using these platforms for their own visions. My dad was very interested in religion. He was very interested in peace building. He was very interested in the civil rights work, which he'd been involved in Chicago for many years. He was very interested in a global perspective. He'd grown up as a kid in Baltimore. His father lost everything in the Depression. My dad ended up serving 5 years in World War II, saw his fellow sailors killed during that war, and was very much a child of the war and the Depression, and came out of those experiences, I think he did at least, with a firm conviction that both his country and his faith commitments required something different of him. And he spoke about this at length throughout his life. He had been a warrior. He'd been involved in war. He'd seen war. He'd watched war. He'd seen the impact of war. Even before the Second World War, he'd visited Germany. He'd puzzled over how people could become so violent, so hostile to one another, so nationalistic, so territorial. So when he was asked to lead the Peace Corps, it didn't exist, but in some ways it was perfect. Like, build something that my uncle, President Kennedy, said, build something that will bring the young people of America closer to the people of the rest of the world. And, you know, if divine providence had established a job for my dad to figure out, it would have been that.
Yes.
So he built the Peace Corps from nothing and traveled all over the world in the early 1960s, went from country to country. Will you accept? He had these stories in Thailand, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, Tanganyika at the time. Will you, Julius Nyerere, will you accept young Americans to come here, teach English, dig wells, plant fields, build schools, those kinds of things. And, he was so excited by the idea that Americans would live eye to eye. They wouldn't be in the State Department. They wouldn't be they'd live in the village. They'd learn the language. They'd eat the food. They'd meet other human beings. This was a passion for him. Meanwhile, my mom was at home. Her passion had always been the rights and gifts of people with intellectual disabilities. In 1961, when President Kennedy took office, hundreds of thousands of Americans were in institutions for life. And her own sister, my Aunt Rosemary, had been, treated horribly throughout her childhood, excluded. So my mom was passionate. Well, you have a brother, from her point of view, you have a brother with a lot of juice, right? He's living in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. How, she wanted to use it for her cause. And so she started lobbying for changes in legislation, some of which have continued to be the most important legislation in history. 1963, President Kennedy signed the Construction Act and the Community Mental Health Centers Act just a few weeks before his death at the recommendation of my mother and a panel she convened. Meanwhile, she was also inviting children with intellectual disabilities to our house to swim in the pool and play on the backyard and form a summer camp, which later became the Special Olympics movement, which I have been involved in since I was 2. So I got to grow up in this kind of vortex of faith, social justice, politics. But I'd say the defining feature maybe for today's listener might be something that seems almost antiquated, which was there was a unapologetic conviction that if we work together, we could change the world.
Right.
That wasn't seen as a naive or idealistic or facile, that was obvious.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And not only was it obvious, it was essential they were both daily communicants in the Catholic tradition and deeply read on the devotions of the Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching, but also the great texts of our, the shared tradition with Judaism on social justice from the prophets, from the wisdom traditions, from the Gospels, from the letters of Paul, all inviting that God chose the weak to shame, to turn as nothing to those who think they're something. Those kinds of texts were all over our house and mind and eyes. So that's a little bit about I don't know where else you want to go with that, but I could go on.
I think it grounds really so much of what you've done, and it explains in its nascent shape, though, the way that these chords were intertwined, as you said, of a religious spiritual vision, of deep kind of humanism that saw people for who they really are, who saw the overt challenges of many different kinds that caused people to be threatened in being able to live a fully human life, and your family's devotion to making that happen. So it's, in one sense, you could imagine it emerging in the way that it has in your life in this really quite remarkable flowering, or you could have imagined a kid growing up in that environment and perhaps deciding to go the other way. What was it that snagged you at your own existential level? How did the chemistry of what you've just described actually shape your own spirit to be able to receive it as deeply as you obviously had?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. When I was in high school, I took a summer internship at a legal services clinic. When I went to college, I was, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to go into politics. And I was like, something's not right about that for me. I had a little bit of a hunger to know and meet human beings at a slightly deeper level, including myself. Our family was fast moving, extremely ambitious, beset by, quite horrific violence, but, dedicated to being driven and moving and the acceleration of effort. Time was short, go fast. And there was something about me that wanted to go deep, not fast. I can't exactly tell you what it was. I mean, I have theories about my own childhood and stuff like that, but I won't take everybody to the couch. I'll just say that by the time I was in college, I took one class in teacher preparation in education, and I did a site visit to a large urban public school about 3/4 of a mile from the campus. And I spent 2 hours there. That was the assignment. And I can tell you right now, I knew right then and there, I wasn't leaving that place. I had found the chaos, the honesty, the anger, the hunger. It was just all there. I was like, oh my God, these kids are living on the edge of despair and chaos and fury and love and hunger. And I was like, I want to know who these human beings are. And I want to know what I can do to contribute in some way to strengthening their hopes and dreams. And it was, I can see the pictures from those, we all forget 98% of life, but you remember the things that imprint. And I can remember the pictures from Richard C. Lee High School that day. And I remember visiting one class and hearing the kids talking about, it was a psychology class, and the kids were talking about dreams and fantasy. And the teacher was saying, well, this is what Freud said. And as one kid raises her hand, she said, well, that reminds me, last night I had a dream that I woke up and I didn't have any braces on. Now, I can remember, Mark, this is how it's kind of a little maybe sympathetic. I can remember having braces and I walk around like this the whole time, trying to keep my lips shut so no one, so embarrassing. And this young woman just said, look, I obviously have a fantasy that I won't be embarrassed. And she said it openly. And this is something I wouldn't, like if my kids asked me, did you have braces? I'd be like, well, kind of, sort of. But I would go around the house trying to take down any pictures that showed me that way. There was something about that young woman and that class where I thought, this is a level of openness that I'm not used to. She's just become vulnerable in front of 15 other teenagers or 20 other teenagers. I had never been vulnerable in front of anybody.
Right.
And it was just alluring. It was alluring in every way. And so I ended up studying child development and working on social competence. And then we built a whole field. We called it social and emotional learning because we felt like educators needed the tools that would allow them to go deeper with kids, help kids learn how to find their motivation, find their honest truth, find their capacity to express themselves. All those things which social and emotional learning has become came from, at least in my portion of the field, this recognition that these were the critical features that learning required and that healing poverty and racism and injustice required too. We all needed to become better at the art and science of strengthening our relationships and treating each other better, treating ourselves better, but also treating others better if we were to have a shot at solving, the big problems that I'd heard my uncles and my dad and my mom give speeches about in front of crowds of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions and, all grand and beautiful. But for me, I was like, whoa, I could meet people at the level of the personal and really understand what was going on to make that change. Yeah. So that was attractive to me.
It's an amazing set of instincts that build empathy, which is part of what you've obviously vividly described. And I'm just taken with what it takes to build empathy and to be formed in it with a capacity for empathy. And what you've just named, I think, is one of the key aspects of it, which is admitting vulnerability and acting out weakness and letting that be its own legitimate presence in the midst of a world that, as you said, for you in a particular way, could have squeezed all that out. But yet here it was, an invitation to a much bigger place in a certain way, emotionally and socially, than even the largesse of what your family clearly had massive exposure to. But the universe that is a small person or a young person or a developing person or a person with tremendous challenges in their life, that's remarkable terrain.
Well, it was for me. And I think, people sometimes ask me, well, did you have mentors? I had so many people. I don't know how to describe this. Such a richness of human beings who came into my life at various points and held me, guided me, supported me, loved me, I dare say. It's just, when I look back at it, I think to myself, somebody was being nice to me, sending me all those people. But in a way, it starts with those students because, what people thought and stereotype, you take a high school that's 99% African-American, 60% free and reduced lunch. So it's a low income, people of color, school. And the stereotype is mean kids, bad kids, difficult kids, tough kids, all that. And what I found was the opposite. I found the most forgiving, loving people I'd ever met. So, vulnerability is a nice talking word for us in religious circles these days, but to actually be vulnerable, you have to have somebody, you have to have some confidence that you're going to be okay if you're vulnerable.
Right.
Like I'm talking to you now with, a little teeny bit of vulnerability because I feel like I'm safe.
Right.
I'm safe with you. I trust your audience, and I feel like I have enough support to be able to say things about myself that at different points in my life would have embarrassed me or which I would have tried to hide. We need to, vulnerability is a beautiful thing as long as it is, but it's only, in my view, maybe the best way to put it, it's only possible if you're given safety to be vulnerable. For some people, that safety comes from their relationship with God. They find that, okay, I may be broken, I may be flawed, I may be this, but I'm held, I'm loved, I'm safe. So therefore, I can be honest with you, Mark or Tim or whoever it is. For some people, we need to see a human face that tells us we're okay. And I'm going to be there for you. For some people, that's a therapist. For some people, that's a spouse or a parent or a child. Someone who looks you in the eye and says, I got you. Like, you can't say anything to me that's not going to make me not love you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I hate to say it because it sounds strange in a way, but for me, those 14 years in the New Haven school system, those kids, they yelled at me, they cussed me out, they told me I wasn't telling them the truth, they told me I didn't understand their lives, but somehow they also love me. I don't know how to describe it, but there's an enormous goodness in many of the people in our country who hunger for an opportunity to be seen, who have experienced so much not being seen, understood, treated fairly, and yet, they give people like me a chance. It's really, some people would say, well, they shouldn't have because you should have been fixing the system, not trying to help some 14-year-old. Probably I should have, maybe I should have. But all I can say is when I went after trying to help those 14-year-olds were so good to me.
What did you learn from them about how they expressed empathy toward each other? Like you tell this story about that you did a minute ago about this willingness to confess waking up without braces as an example of public vulnerability. But you must have seen a lot of ways in which this transpired between students. Can you give us any examples or derive any particular patterns that you observed?
I guess I would say, generally speaking, this is a gross generalization that can easily be disproved by a specific example. But I would say that, generally speaking, when we human beings encounter a lot of rejection, we harden, we become fearful. But in the best moments, we also become free because we know that our life doesn't depend on acceptance and security and control. It depends on something else. And I would just say that in those students, and I'd say that, I spent 30 years after leaving New Haven, the school system there and the Special Olympics movement, people with intellectual disabilities in some ways experience enormous humiliation every day. No, I'm sorry you don't belong at this school. I'm sorry you don't belong at this workplace. I'm sorry that at our church we don't have a section. I'm sorry the doctor doesn't have a practice that includes you. I'm sorry the bus doesn't go on your route. I mean, it goes on all the time. And yet, a huge percentage of those same human beings are the most open and welcoming people I've ever met. So there is some moment in our lives where being broken leads to freedom. And I just would say that many of those kids, so treated so bad. I mean, our countries, we have so much work to do still. But I don't know. I mean, you can go on a playground in a place like New Haven and there's a pickup game going on and everybody's making fun of everybody and talking junk to everybody and calling everybody names. But the hugs that come at the end and the laughter and the tenderness, it just seems like they come together. I don't know quite how to describe it, but I think let's put it from the opposite point of view. People of wealth, of means, of support, they end up too frequently putting their faith in money and in self-protection. And that looks good to a lot of people from a distance. And don't get me wrong, to have a nice house or have a nice car or have a nice job or all that's great. I'm not going to tell anybody not to want that or not to recognize how gifted that makes someone, a human being that doesn't have food insecurity, has a place to live. All those are great, maybe even necessary. But sometimes they lead people who have those gifts to trust their life to those gifts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't work. I've seen people with those gifts. I mean, you don't have to take it from me, but I can tell you, I've seen lots of wealthy people, lots of powerful people, lots of secure people behind gates, behind staff, behind wealth. And you go behind the curtain and it's not always a very pretty picture. I can tell you that. So as tempting as it is to think that our lives and our safety will be found through wealth and security and control and public approval, it pretty clear to me that doesn't work. So you got to find it elsewhere. And I just would say that people who've been forced to look elsewhere often find it in a deeper source.
Mm-hmm. I came to a much deeper embrace of Christian faith when I was in college. And one of the things that I think first struck me about the teaching and modeling of Jesus was that it was about reordering our sociology and re-envisioning the world and how we see ourselves and our neighbor and even our enemies, how we see God. And of course, with that then came a flowering of completely different relationships than I think I had really before. Although one of the drumbeats through that whole season had been a deep sense of being affected by disabled friends who were like a clarion call to reality in a certain way, that I felt a hunger when I was with them for more of reality. Like I wanted to be, as much as I could, in their reality. I wanted to understand and receive and know them, but I also wanted to learn from them. I also wanted to see the world in a way that their eyes alone could help me see, rather than simply the sociology of my birth or my own individual instincts or whatever that may be.
Yeah.
You obviously spent, decades in the Special Olympics movement and are still committed and involved in it in various ways. I'm curious what you would say about that experience, building on what you were just describing of these 14 years teaching in New Haven. And then it seems like going on, there was both a continuity and a still newer, deeper kind of connection with kids and with their, the society would describe as their impairment.
Yeah. I've been reflecting recently on this text that several gospels have similar texts, but the text where Jesus is going by and there's a blind man and he works his way up, stamps, and he says, Rabbi, I need your help. This is obviously not a direct quote. And Jesus asks this really quite extraordinary question. What do you want? And the answer is, I want to see. And so, of course, we can read this as the transcendent power of God-man, Jesus, the Son of God, as being able to miraculously restore his physical sight. But I also hear in that, the Beatitude, blessed are the pure of heart, they shall see. So I think a lot of what moved me or what moves me is learning how to see, not just knowing that you should see, but actually learning how to see. What is Special Olympics? It's a track meet, right? Or it's a swimming race, or it's a soccer game. But it doesn't take a lot to jump into a different dimension of what is happening. The average human being, Mark or Tim, neurotypical, if I can use that language, walks to the side of the field and sees 6 athletes, 12 years old, with Down syndrome or autism, line up on a track and run. And, the arms go up at the end and somebody comes in third and she's 12 years old. And there's something in these moments at least for me, where Mark knows, Tim knows that child was, maybe a surprise at birth. Maybe the doctor said, I'm sorry. Maybe the preschool said, I'm sorry. Maybe the average 12-year-old with Down syndrome has never been to a birthday party. And her arms are up in the air, and you're learning how to see.
Totally.
You're learning how to see beyond the distortions of culture and society and upbringing and normative behavior and all that. And so, you go to a Special Olympics event and, it's not uncommon that half the people in the stands have tears in their eyes.
Right.
And they're not crying because they're sad for the athlete. They're crying because something is coming out of them.
Yes, right.
They're shedding those. It's almost as though they got there saying, I want to see.
Yes.
And the athlete turns to them and says, here I
right.
Here I am, see me. I have run my race. I have given it my all. I have raised my arms. I am victorious. That's who I am.
Yes.
So what my parents were great at, going all the way back to them, and what I think we're trying to do now as a culture, and many of your, I'm sure, people who are listening, how do we create new structures that give us the chance to see each other? It doesn't just have to be Down syndrome. It could be a Republican, for goodness sakes. It could be a Democrat. It could be a person of color. It could be a person of LGBTQ background. You don't have to agree with their approach on immigration or, their vision of what the tax rate ought to be or oughtn't to be. I mean, we're going to have differences on that. Well, why wouldn't you have a difference on that? I mean, what kind of a world would it be if nobody differed on the capital gains tax rate?
Right.
I mean, as though that should determine our relationships, that should determine how we see one another. It's a joke. And we're so far off, all of us, I'm not accusing anybody here, but we're so far off this invitation which I want to bring to the proverbial altar of my life. I want to see.
Yes. Amen. I've often thought that the story is instead that we misperceive one another, then we misname each other, and then we misact in a way that is legitimate in light of our first two mistakes of the misperception and misnaming. Yeah. And when I go to Special Olympics events, which I have on a number of occasions, I experience what you've just described, which is this sense that I am being taught to see, and I am not only grateful for the re-seeing, I'm shocked, I'm stunned, I'm shamed, I'm awakened, I'm alerted, I'm moved, I'm tearful, like all of the things that I just know happens in Special Olympics events and in friendships with people with disabilities whose personal lives we are privileged, many of us, to come to know it well enough to, again, have that one-on-one exposure to the unexpected seeing that comes. I do think sight is a huge piece of this, the vision part. Yeah,
I think so. And, the reason I left my full-time role at Special Olympics, I still volunteer and serve on the board and stuff like that and go to as many events as I can. And my wife runs a local program, a basketball program in the wintertime here in our neighborhood, a Special Olympics unified sports program. But I left the full-time role because I felt like I'd been schooled in this seeing. And as hard as I tried when I talked about Special Olympics to help people see the power of the invitation to their everyday lives, people kept saying, oh, that's wonderful. It's wonderful what you do for people with intellectual disabilities. I'm like, no. What they're doing for you is teaching you how to see your cousin who you can't talk to. Who you've put in an institution of your mind, too different to get along with. Same language as what put 200,000 Americans is. You're too different to fit in. You're too broken to be able to belong. You're too deficient to fit to work in my world. So we put you in an institution. But it's not just people with intellectual disabilities we do this to. We do this to our own family members. And we have a culture that actually applauds you for doing it. Hey, Mark, you cut her off. Good for you. stand up for principle. You tell her you're never going to speak to her again.
Right.
Like on social media. Send this to my friends. Look what Mark did. He told her once and for all, she's finished,
Right.
Wait a minute. Hold on. Stop the presses. So that's why we started this work. We call it the dignity movement, which is the same principle that comes from that person, from me watching those races for 30 plus years, 40 years of my life still. And it's a practice, it's not a one and done. That's why I go back, because I need the practice to continue to practice. But we need the practice in the rest of the culture, in my view. So we built this dignity movement to sort of invite people to see, not that you should agree with a MAGA Republican or a woke Democrat or a rural farmer or a gun owner or a gun fighter or a gun opposer. You don't have to agree with any of those people, depending on where you locate yourself. But you could actually treat them with dignity. You could actually say to the 12-year-old with Down syndrome, well, you might not, maybe you won't go to law school, maybe you will, but maybe you won't, but I'll still treat you with, maybe you won't become a CPA, but you still have, maybe you won't fit into some kind of structure in my faith institution, but I've got a place for you. We can say the same thing to our brothers and sisters who have different political views, who come from different faith traditions. I mean, isn't that what the faith traditions mostly share, at least as I've come to understand? They mostly share a conviction that everybody is made in the image and likeness of God, depending on what language one uses. It varies a little bit from tradition to tradition. But what if we just started and let's build a practice around that? Just that. Let's forget for a moment the Ten Commandments. Let's forget for a moment the moral exhortations of the Catholic Church or the Baptist community or Methodists or Reformed Jews or Orthodox Judaism. Let's just forget that. Let's just start with what's the practice of how to see Mark and Tim as made in the image and likeness of God. How do we do that? I'm not saying don't do the other stuff. Let's just do that in addition.
Right. Yes.
That's what we've been working on.
And this is part of what led to the development of what is called the Dignity Index. And as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that particular tool came into existence because of political speech, but that it really has been taken up passionately by all kinds of institutions and contexts, which may not have been its original audience. But tell us a bit about that story.
So we were having conversations just like this, me and a bunch of other folks. We did some focus groups with kids. We talked to political people like, Karl Rove and David Axelrod. We talked to Peace Corps volunteers and community organizers. And what's going on? What's going on? And the conclusion we reached was that we're not being torn apart by difference. We're being torn apart by the way we treat each other when we differ.
Mm-hmm. A practice again.
Back to a practice or a skill. How do we treat others when we differ? Right? That's a different problem than that we differ. If you name the problem as we're too different, you go down one path. Let's figure out how to make everybody the same, or let's figure out how to make my team beat your team. Those are basically the paths. But when the question is how do I treat you when we differ, that's a different path. That's how do we strengthen relationships? How do we speak truth without hatred and venom? How do we open our minds to the dignity of the other? There's a whole different path. So we said, well, let's map it. Let's show people that there's a scale, like you can treat people with dignity no matter what, or you can say, I'm going to kill you because you're such a disaster. So we did this mapping exercise, and what it turned out to be, Mark, was kind of like almost a map of our inner lives. Not a perfect one, and not certainly the whole of our inner lives, but on this issue of how you treat someone, do you treat them with dignity or contempt? We mapped it out as a scale from 1 to 8. 1 is you're not human, you deserve to die. And 8 is I love you no matter what. I don't necessarily have to agree with you, but I'm going to love you even when I don't agree with you. That's an 8. And in the middle, you'd have people, you have language like, well, our team's just better than your team. It's kind of disdain. That would be like a 3 on the dignity index. And, maybe at a 6, it's like, no, I'm curious. I bet we have common ground, Mark. We don't agree on everything, but where could we find, that's a 6, A 2 is, you're disgusted me. 7 is, I probably still have something to learn. I feel strongly about what I think, but I need to understand more deeply, even the places we disagree, because I can grow. That's like 7 language. So all of a sudden people are saying like, oh, I could use this with my wife or my husband, or, oh, I could use this with my teenager when she comes, or, oh, my roommate, he's always, I'm going to try this with my roommate. And then all of a sudden business people are saying, oh, we have to use this with our senior managers so they build talent that's inclusive and healthy. And then pastors came to us and said, oh, I'm going to preach on this. And then educator says, oh, I want to teach my kids how to solve problems. We have a restorative practice. We can show kids how to use this skill when they're in a conflict. And then governors came. Governor Spencer Guy said, oh, I can use this in my leadership. And then when it comes time for a very difficult situation like the horrific murder of Charlie Kirk in Utah, Governor Spencer Cox, who was actively leading on this stuff, had a whole range of tools to talk about the crisis that didn't demonize, in my view at least, didn't demonize politically anybody. He tried to navigate the horrors of the crime, but distinguish those from the dignity of all people on all sides of the political spectrum. It shouldn't be a fine line to draw, but it is.
Right. It is currently.
So this dignity index, we call it an index, which allows you to score, I'm going to go back to what we said earlier, also is a little bit of a tool for how to see.
Yes, absolutely.
How do you see a path through conflict where you don't compromise your principles, but you also treat people with dignity? That is the superpower in this work.
And it also allows a person to see themselves in relationship to other people on the spectrum.
That's right. You're right, because that's the first, we call this the mirror effect. People look at the index, and I encourage listeners, just go to dignity.us, just pull it up.
Yes, we'll have it in our notes.
Yeah, spend 5 minutes on it, not more. Don't spend more than 5 minutes on it. And look at 1, 2, 3, 4, and look at 5, 6, 7, 8. And almost invariably, and I'd love people to write me if this doesn't happen, or if it does, almost invariably people say, ooh, I'd used 2 language last week when I spoke to my friend Mark, and we talked about, the mayor or the governor. Or I used 3 language yesterday with my son. Oh my God. So we call this the mirror effect. People see the language and they see themselves. They don't wait, it's not Tim saying, you're a naughty boy, Mark. You've got demerits here and you're going to be, in big trouble. Stay after school, write your name 500 times on the blackboard. I know blackboards don't exist anymore, but it's actually people seeing themselves. And it's one of the most exciting things about this, that there's a sense of self-discovery that comes from just seeing this map and seeing yourself on it. So it's been very exciting because I think that it's exciting in part because there's so much hunger in our country for how do we do this differently? How do we solve problems? How do we ease divisions? How do we prevent violence? My God. Attempts on the lives of governors and presidents and people of faith and the Jewish tradition and the basement of churches while people are at prayer, and Catholic churches and LDS communities butchered in broad daylight because of this incendiary culture of toxic hatred and demonization. Couldn't we do better? People are really hungry for that. So we don't have all the solutions, don't get me wrong. But we've got at least an opening that gives people some sense of possibility.
So using that same index kind of mentality, when recently in the last year, there's been discussion of something that has been labeled toxic empathy. Mm. What do you think, first of all, is actually being referred to by that? And how does it and doesn't it relate to what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on it. I've heard about it. So I'm going to be commenting on this with remote knowledge. But here's what we've heard, which I think may be related. We've heard people say, well, are you telling me I should have empathy for something or someone who is doing something horrible? Now, that's something horrible in the eyes of a person of very strident moral upbringing might be something moral. Somebody else, it might be something political. It might be something where someone's been violent. You want me to have empathy for this person who's killed this other innocent human being, or two or three or whatever it might be. And so there's this equating empathy with excusing. Empathy is not excusing. Dignity is not excusing. In fact, they're the opposite, in my view. Empathy is knowing and understanding. Dignity is valuing and seeing. Neither of those excuse oppression or racism or violence or moral crimes of whatever sort. In fact, they give us a better shot of seeing clearly what the crime is. So I think there's some sense in particularly people who have very strong political beliefs that when they hear someone like me, they think what I'm saying is, oh, you should just be nice to everybody. No. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being nice. I'm all for it. Or they think you should be a centrist on everything. Mark and Tim disagree. Why don't they just compromise and find a middle ground? No, that's not what this work suggests. What this work suggests is that you will have a superpower if you fight for your principles with all the passion you've got and add one principle. Treat the other human being with dignity at the same time. Work for the programs, the policies, the plans, the outcomes. Name the facts, the principles at stake. Do not attack the human being's dignity.
Right.
It actually makes you much more powerful. So I'm not suggesting empathy should be an excuse for principle or for accountability or for the pursuit of moral goodness or political goodness or economic goodness. I'm suggesting that empathy is a way to understand the other so you can pursue those things. So I think it sometimes gets that's a little bit maybe nuanced. I don't know. It's hard to maybe hold those things in tension for many of us, me included, by the way. But I don't think we're picking the right target if we're opposing empathy.
Right. To make that the enemy would be the height of irony.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes great sense to me. And I think it's all part of living out of a different spirit in which you're really convinced, not just cognitively, but convinced in your inner being that the person in front of us or on the screen or wherever they might be is a person of dignity because they've been made in God's image and are intrinsically valuable. That basic principle, which from a Christian point of view and commonly from a broad cultural point of view and a multi-religious point of view, is something which has been actually at the core of human struggles from the very, very beginning, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about something that's about primal disorientation, primal misperception, out of fear, out of anxiety, out of danger, out of whatever it might be. And I'm just very challenged by the example that you personally give for this, but also by the people I know who are leading exemplars in my mind of people in all kinds of different stages of life and leadership. And as you say, it strengthens the leader to be able to bring all of that to the table, whereas it reveals an underlying weakness when they're not able, even though none of us, and myself included, does that perfectly, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think there's I think this is a practice. I do believe that it requires, some attention, to what Thomas Merton, the 20th century Trappist monk, called the pure glory of God in us.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote these beautiful texts at the center of our being is a point that's untouched, which is the pure glory of God in us. So it requires a certain, I would say almost practice of being in touch with that in yourself. Because if you can't feel it or know it, then you can't see from it. And then you're not going to see it. You're going to see the superficial. You're going to see the Down syndrome. You're going to see the Republican, or you're going to see the Democrat, or whatever it is you don't want to see. You're going to see the label, to your earlier point. So we need a practice. We need practices. This has been true over time. If you read, for instance, Mark, I've been going back over and over again. I've done this, I must have read this a dozen times now in the last couple of months. Rereading Dr. King's A Letter from the Birmingham City Jail, which is really, in my view, I'd love someone to tell me I'm wrong about this, or at least give me alternatives. I think it's the preeminent document in American history that captures the capacity to see the dignity and and work and labor for the high principle of social change that as he saw it at the same time. And in that letter, amongst the many genius moments in it, he writes about the requirement of self-purification, which is sounds like old-fashioned language to us. But he meant something meant something quite precise there. And that is that we need this practice, this sustained practice of being in touch with our own dignity so that we can see the dignity of the other. We will get distracted. We will get pulled away from it. We will get scared. We will get threatened. We will get angry. We will have righteous indignation. We will feel humiliated, and we will humiliate. But with a practice of return to that still small space within us in the scriptural language, still small voice, I think we have a chance at this point in history to invite a certain newness of commitment that comes from maybe our faith traditions, not for everybody, but for many people, but brings from our faith traditions this hunger for the capacity to see the common humanity that exists within each of us that is given to us by our Creator. That's a practice we don't, I spent a lot of time in churches. You more than me, I suppose, but I spent a lot of time in churches. And I'm going to say, I don't think most churches teach that anywhere near as much as they could or should. And not because they don't teach other important things. That's not my point. My point is that this is a pretty big one.
Right. Very central one.
It's a central one. So
absolutely.
I'm looking for strategies and people and ideas for how we can inspire and learn from people who are teaching it well. That's
right.
amazing.
So one of the great beauties, obviously, of the Roman Catholic faith is, in particular, the Eucharist. And I'm curious, in this very central sense that you've just been describing, what it means to see and perceive and love people in these compassionate, dignified ways. How does the Eucharist, in your tradition, how has that formed you and helped illuminate some of the things we've just been talking about?
Okay, start a new hour together.
Yes, I know. At least another hour.
It's hard for me to adequately express my love of the Eucharist. I find in this prayer, technically called a sacrament, but in the prayer of the Eucharist, this reenactment of the unconditional self-gift of God to us without condition. And it's not a theoretical practice. It's not a conceptual or ideological practice. It's a physical practice to consume, to take in both the building up of one's body and the pouring out of one's blood, the inevitable cycle of life as God's gift within us. I just can't think of, nothing has approximated that practice for me. And I've tried a lot of other things, by the way. And I also have a practice of silence, which is, I highly recommend also. Contemplative prayer or Christian meditation or centering prayer, or, the Eastern traditions all have these Zen and Mahayana Buddha, the different Buddhist traditions have these practices. All of them have practices of silence. Our Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters typically have not played up the practice of silence, but I think that's very important. But the Eucharist has this uniquely, I think, Jesus-centric offer that God has a human face, not just a concept, not just a spirit, not just a force, a face. And that face is for you, right here at this altar, right? Concretely, you may hold, you may touch, you may drink of the face of God. I just find it to be, I had a conversation once with a Catholic priest, good friend of mine. I won't name him because he's somewhat well known. And I said, what do you think is going to survive of the Catholic tradition in 100 or 200 or 300 years? No, I don't know. He said, probably the Catholic emphasis on intellectual rigor, the deep commitment to scholarship and intellectual rigor. I said, well, what about the Eucharist? He says, oh, I don't know. I don't know about the sacraments. It seems like they get... I said, but don't you think if you were in the mind of Christ, you would have to come up with something like this if you wanted to close the chapter of your life? Wouldn't you have to show people that you're still there, that your whole story, that the whole message is I'm giving myself to you. You don't have to earn it. Wouldn't you have to come up with something? Like, what would you come up with to be the thing that would do that for people? And he said, okay, well, that's a good point. But I think to myself, like, if you're Jesus, I know this, maybe sounds sacrilegious to people. I don't mean it that way. I just mean, like, I sometimes try to get into the mind of people who we read about. And maybe you have this sense in which your life is coming to its final chapter. A lot of people end up knowing these things. And you think to yourself, what am I going to give to these people that will help them get it? I mean, they didn't get it. Even up to the end, they didn't get it. I mean, they all went running, right? So what am I going to give? What can I do? What can I say that they'll hear me over and over again trying to continue to teach this lesson? And my view is he came up with a pretty darn good practice.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a beautiful ending to our conversation for today, which could have gone on for another hour just about the Eucharist quite happily. But I do think it, precisely for the reasons that you gave, Tim, that it is a distillation of the practice of what it looks like to live in a world where you demonstrate self-giving love and where you demonstrate human dignity. Yeah. And I just want to say on behalf of many people who are listening to this, how grateful many, many of us are for you personally, for all that you've been doing and are doing. And I think the point, as you would be the first to emphasize, is not you or what you're specifically doing, but the work that you're contributing to is central human work, and it is honoring to God, and it's life-giving to many, many people touched by the implications of all of it. So thank you, and thank you for your generosity of time and thought today in this conversation.
Well, thank you for your beautiful questions, for this beautiful community you've created. And, I think we're all at a time of great change, Mark. And the last thing I'll say is, it's another quote from Thomas Merton. I don't know where I'm going, really. I mean, but I do hunger. I do want to bring about the will of God. I do want to. And maybe that's all I've got, the desire. And if I'm doing a good job or not, I really don't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But I do hunger. And I think a lot of people do. I think most people want, hunger to belong to that will larger than themselves. And in that work, if we can just recognize each other in that hunger, I think we make a big step forward. Amen. So thank you.
Amen. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.